Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you also very much for joining us today. For those of you who are new to the Council Town Hall, we are a nonprofit with the mission of informing our members and audiences about the most compelling international, national, and regional issues. We are a nonpartisan organization, and an important part of our programs is that we enable our audience to ask questions of the speakers and to foster a more engaged discussion. We will be taking your questions in about 25 to 30 minutes. You can submit your questions by entering them on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and she'll try to get to as many of your questions as she can. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Restoring U.S. Global Leadership. This is a conversation with the President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kempe, moderated by Robert J. Abernethy, Chairman of the American Standard Development Company and longtime board member of both the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Bob, thank you for returning to moderate yet another terrific program today. Let me turn this over to you both. We can't wait for this to begin. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone, welcome Fred to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall. You were born, we were born, both at the same time, 1954. The council has been serving Los Angeles since 1954, just as you have been serving other people in your life and later in the greater world since that point in time. I'm a latecomer. I didn't join the council until 1969, 15 or so years later. You've had a distinguished career in journalism with the Wall Street Journal and with other outlets. You've also led the Atlantic Council for a decade and a half. But I'd like to start with your early years in Salt Lake City. You grew up in Salt Lake City. Tell us about those years and the University of Utah and how that sort of laid the basis for who you are today.
Bob, thank you so much, and thank you for the question. First of all, in front of this audience, I just want to say how much the Atlantic Council owes to Bob Abernethy, vice chair of our board, a close friend, advisor, and I grow from your wisdom all the time, Bob. So thank you so much for putting me on the other end of questions. Yes, I grew up in Salt Lake City, but I grew up in a pretty unique way in that I'm a first-generation American. Both my parents were German immigrants. And so on the one hand, I was in the heart of America. On the other hand, in my household and with my relatives and with my aunts and uncles, I was in the heart of Europe. And so even though I never went east of Denver, Colorado until I turned age 17, I always had a yearning to be in the world. And once I went east, I never turned back. I just traveled around the world, worked for the Wall Street Journal, and have lived my life as an international life, really from shortly after I graduated from the University of Utah, and then went on to Columbia. But I think where something's particular about a Utah upbringing, it's really hard to be cynical if you grow up in Utah. It's not a cynical place. And so I really approach the world. Doesn't mean I'm not skeptical, doesn't mean I don't ask the tough questions, but by and large, I believe in the opportunity for people most people want to make things better, and particularly in our country's opportunity to remake itself, rekindle itself, reinvent itself, which has been the great strength of the United States and something we saw pretty dramatically in the last few days.
How did you get interested in journalism, and how did you make the choice to go to the Columbia University School of Journalism?
Well, I could be facetious and use the Rocky Balboa answer, which would be I can't sing or dance, and so I went into journalism. I was inspired by an elder sister, and her name was Jeanette, and she was working as a journalist at a local underground newspaper during the '68 uprising And even in Utah, there were seizing of buildings and different activities of the '68 uprising. And she was 8 years older than I was, and I remember vividly dropping her off at her news place, circulating newspapers. And I said to myself, "Wow, this sounds pretty interesting." And then I took my first high school journalism class as a junior in high school. I started really as a sports journalist, but after getting involved in international affairs in college, after visiting Germany, which is the homeland of my parents, after getting to know a group that helped people escape from behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. They had been wrapped up. A couple of them had been sent to jail. So they told me their story. I said, well, this is somewhat more interesting than a basketball game. And so I said to myself, I really want to put journalism together with foreign affairs.
So when you left or getting ready to leave Columbia, what were you thinking about? Where did you go?
It's so interesting. I was offered a well-paying job on the copy desk of the Chicago Tribune. And I was offered a lousy paying job at something called the Rome Daily American in Italy. And of course, I took the lousy paying job and I went to Italy. I started freelancing for there. And so my first decision was, I don't really want to sit at a desk inside of a newsroom. I really want to get my hands dirty. I really want to be out in the field. And I think that was a crucial decision. And I think it's a crucial decision for any young person getting involved in foreign affairs, is the earlier you can actually experience the world, the earlier you can be out looking at history. I had the great advantage, great luxury of being hired at Newsweek and then the Wall Street Journal as a foreign correspondent. And I always feel that I was like a professional athlete being paid to do my sport. They were sending me all over the place to write what Philip Graham, the publisher, late publisher of the Washington Post, called the first draft of history. Whether it was the rise of solidarity in Poland, whether it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, whether it was wars in Lebanon, in Iraq, it really was a tremendous privilege to write for a great newspaper and be able to cover some of the most important stories of that time.
Where did the copy editor work for the Salt Lake Tribune come into that scheme of things?
Yeah, that was early. That was boy, you really know a lot, Bob. You've done some investigation. That was early on when I was in college, undergraduate. I had to pay for my school. I didn't have well-off parents, and I didn't have very much myself. And so I worked full-time through most of my undergraduate schooling at the Salt Lake Tribune, sometimes covering high school sports. But then the big job was being a copy editor, because that was actually a real salary with a real wage. And that was a way that I could help pay to get myself through college.
Today, we have a new president. We have a world that has serious problems. The way I view it is the four big ones are COVID, the pandemic, and getting the rate of dying and the rate of hospitalization solved way down, bringing back the economy, particularly for those of us who are trying to put food on the table to feed our kids and pay the rent for the next month, save being evicted, and making life work for us, that part of the economy. The third thing is the social fabric of America that seems to be torn apart, which is involved with the Black Lives Matter issues and racial justice and things of this sort. And the fourth big area that I look at is climate change. I understand you were in conversation, maybe just Zoom-wise or virtually yesterday with Xi Jinping, the leader of China. China has come through a year last year where I believe they have about a 2.3% growth in their economy, where we've had in the US about a 3.6% contraction, and Europe has contracted even more, about 7.4%. What did you talk about with Xi Jinping, or what did he say about the global health crisis in America and economics of the world?
Yeah, so first of all, watching Xi Jinping provide the opening keynote for the World Economic Forum, I can't say I spoke with him, but I did listen to him. So it's interesting, and I'm going to come right back to that, Bob, but it's interesting you picked these sort of what I would call the quadruple whammy of 2020, biggest health crisis of a century, biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression, biggest racial upheavals that we had since in 50 years. Now you added climate change to that, which we do a lot of work on, and I would do that as well, but also the most divisive election perhaps of our lifetimes in the United States. And I write a weekly column for CNBC, which I also circulate as a newsletter called Inflection Point. I do that because I think there's an inflection point in the world right now, as important as the end of World War I and the end of World War II. And at both of those times, US leadership was crucial. At the end of World War II, it turned out better. We ended up with the International Liberal Order, the creation of NATO, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial institutions, the European Coal and Steel Community, which became the European Union. These are the institutions that exist to this day. After World War I, we got it more wrong than right, and we ended up with the collapse of the League of Nations, a Versailles Treaty that really didn't get us properly out of World War I, and millions of dead from World War II, from World War II, and from the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, etc. I say all that because I think we're in an inflection point now again, maybe of similar generational consequences as was the case after World War I and World War II. There are a number of things that drive this inflection point, but I'll just list four very quickly. One of them is a new power, a new era of major power competition, particularly involving the United States and China, but also Russia and others. The second is a contest between democracy and autocracy. And since 2006, according to Freedom House, there's been a recession in democratic rights across the world, in individual countries, and then some fraying and failed democracies. Number three, there are uncertainties about what kind of leadership the United States wants to have on the global stage. For the last 75 years, we've been, to a certain extent, the glue that's held the international liberal order together. A lot of Americans think that's been too much of a burden on us. And so where does that go now? And then the whole global system of institutions and rules that I talked about, it's who knows where it's going to go. And that brings us to Xi Jinping. It's clear that it's now Joe Biden's America, but I think we have to ask ourselves whether it's going to be Xi Jinping's and China's world. And if you read the speech at the World Economic Forum, that's more or less what it says. I mean, I've got the copy right here. And the title of the speech, listen to this for a minute, Bob, because it's the kind of thing, can you imagine an American president having this title? Remember, Biden's title of his inaugural speech was America United. Very simple, I'm going to get the job done. I've got to solve America before I solve the world. Xi Jinping's speech was, let the torch of multilateralism light up humanity's way forward. So what he's saying to the world community of the World Economic Forum is, we think it's our moment. It's the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. As you said, Bob, they got back to growth from COVID-19 faster than anybody. They could have 8% or more growth this year. Europe, for the first time ever, in 2020 had more trade with China. So China surpassed the United States as the European Union's leading trading partner. Not many people understood that. So many of our most important allies, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and then in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, now have China as their major trading partner. And Xi Jinping drew a picture in his speech of a world where China was going to set the terms of behavior for the future. But one of those terms were that we're not going to intervene in each other's internal business. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, that makes sense. But on the other hand, is there a genocide of the Uyghur Muslim minority inside China? If so, should the world really just stand aside and not worry about it? Should we really not care about the rights in Hong Kong being pressed out entirely? But I think this is a turning point where it will be determined whether authoritarianism or democracy is the flavor of the future. So I think the presidency of Joe Biden is really important. And he sees the first thing he's got to do is get American growth back, take care of COVID-19, rebuild our infrastructure, invest in our technology. So he knows that first and foremost, he has to get America back. But second of all, he wants to get, as one of his key officials has told me, the band back together, meaning allies and partners working in concert again across the world. So it's going to be very interesting to see how far he can go. But we do have the promise and the potential for a transformative presidency because the times call for it. But it's not going to be easy to get there.
Speaking of China, how do we balance where we need to cooperate and where we need to push back from them on that? How does that relate to use of the South China Sea, to Taiwan, and to what extent we ban or don't ban their electronic products, and what effect does that have on where they order semiconductors from?
It's a great question, Bob. I think where the Biden administration is going is there is a large amount of consensus in Washington that China is a real challenge for us, and maybe, and I believe it will be the defining challenge of the Biden administration and of our era, where we go in terms of relationship with China. And you hit the absolute most difficult question, which is how do you contest China and compete with China where you must, while not letting that escalate into warfare, into a military exchange, and at the same time find points of collaboration. So I think the Biden administration is going to try to do that. I think if you talk to the Biden people, they actually give the Trump administration some credit for actually calling out China on some of its most egregious misbehavior, and then sort of rallying the United States to recognize that. But it never turned into a coherent strategy. So there was some trade punishment there, there were some sanctions there, but there wasn't a coherent strategy. So I think I don't want to call this a Cold War because it doesn't have to be yet, but it's as if we were in the first years of a new era where we're defining this relationship. We have to work together on issues like arms control, certainly on climate issues that you spoke about, where China wants to work together with us, while at the same time on questions of international property, questions of unfair state subsidies of Chinese companies, other areas where we think China's misbehaving. We have to come to them not as the United States, but as a common front. We had 50% of global GDP at the end of World War II. It was easy to impose our will in many respects. We now have, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 20 and 25% of global GDP. We can't do anything with allies. If we come to China alone, we have no leverage. If we come to China with our partners and allies from Asia and Europe on economic and other issues, that's 60% of GDP instead of 25% of GDP, and we're going to have more leverage. So I think that's where I think we should go, which is China's not going away. Its economic success is massive. Its technological evolution and capabilities are head spinning. They really have come a long way. This is going to be a situation we have to live with and manage for decades to come. So we have to get very serious about how we both collaborate and how we compete, and set a set of rules and understandings so that this relationship doesn't spin out of control.
Let me turn for a moment to Russia. We have demonstrations in over 100 Russian cities now. The prime opponent of Putin was poisoned by the Russian state not too long ago. He has returned to Russia. Yesterday, President Biden spoke with Putin on the telephone. Start out by telling us what your understanding of that telephone conversation was. What was its content, and where do we go from here with relationships with Russia?
So if China is going to be the defining international challenge, and I think it's a domestic challenge too. Can we get our economy together? Can we get growth? Can we develop our technology? If China is the defining challenge of our times, Russia is the first foreign policy challenge for the Biden administration. If China is the country that that wants to replace the United States as the most dominant international leader, then Russia wants to disrupt the United States. So it's a very different situation. And you know, I was talking to a Chinese friend who also said, to understand Chinese leadership, you have to know that we view leadership differently. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you think as Americans that leadership is being at the top of the heap. We think of leadership as being the center of attention. We want people to pay obeisance to Beijing. And so it's a really interesting, different way of looking. But to your question about Russia, the Putin Biden relationship, you know, Joe Biden, Vice President Biden before, President Biden now, is well known to the Russians. And they know that if President Trump, like Putin, wanted to work with Putin, even though his administration was really quite tough on Russia, Biden isn't cut from that cloth. Biden doesn't trust Putin, doesn't trust his intentions. But on the other hand, it gets back to you were talking about before, Bob, which is you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so that's what Biden's doing. The walking for him is let's come back into a really important arms control treaty, which they're now coming back into, because there's no benefit in President Biden's view and his top officials' view from not talking to the country that, with the United States, has the most nuclear weapons on Earth. And we had quit talking to each other. So there was some feeling we should bring in the Chinese. There was some feeling the Russians are cheating. But if you're not talking, you don't have any venue to deal with this. So Biden, first and foremost, said, I want to extend New START for 5 years and complete the extension by February 5th. And I think they'll probably even get ahead of that. At the same time, Biden did what I don't think Trump has done, which he said, you know, we want to work with you on this, but we will defend Ukraine's sovereignty, so don't take away the independent sovereignty of Ukraine. We want to know more about the bounties you put on US soldiers in Afghanistan, basically allegedly paying for their deaths. We want to talk to you about the interference in US elections. And we're particularly unhappy right now about the SolarWinds hack, which one of the biggest cyber hacks ever, maybe the biggest ever, and it certainly is relatively apparent. Most experts think it has Chinese fingerprints all over it. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, one of just a really interesting opposition figure, and with the biggest protests that we've had in Russia in anybody's recent memory. And Sunday there's going to be another set of demonstrations. You have to believe from past experience that Putin will be able to crack down on this and get things under control again because he has all the power of the state behind him. On the other hand, what Navalny is talking about is corruption. And the Russian people are very upset at official corruption. And that's where he's really stirred people up. So there is the possible, using the name of my column, there is the possibility that this could be an inflection point for Putin, that this could be the beginning of the end, and that Russians are at this point fed up. My argument would be, whether or not that's the fact, we missed a big opportunity at the end of the Cold War to bring Russia in. There are a lot of people in Russia that would like to be more closely integrated with the West. We ought to be thinking of a plan. If Putin leaves next week or Putin leaves 10 years from now, we ought to think of a plan whereby we can find a good way to bring Russia into Western institutions, the global institutions, and finally make this adversary a partner. So I think that Biden has the right approach, though, which is we've done it before with Russia. Be tough where you have to be tough. Make sure they know that we oppose them on these grounds. But it's in our interest to work with them on nuclear weapons issues and other issues where not to do so is just too dangerous.
I just wanted to take a moment to take off on your comment about the Russian state poisoning Alexei. It brings my mind to Los Angelino, who has just completed a wonderful film that talks about climate change, immigration, and he was poisoned by the Russian state in a hotel in Toronto. The film is a 2-hour full-length film, has not quite been released yet, but I recommend it to all you guys who are listening to us to go see it when it comes out. It's called Francisco, after Pope Francis. And this is a filmmaker who, the reason he was poisoned by the Russian state was he made a very provocative film about the Ukraine winter fire, and another provocative film about Syria called Crisis in Syria. So Francisca is very well worthwhile viewing when it does come out. And I expect it will be out the first week of April, the week that has Easter in it. I would like to turn, Fred, for a moment to another part of the world. I'd like to go to the Middle East. Syria has had a decade-long civil war. There is a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. There are continuing hostilities between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There is a rising death toll all over the Middle East with COVID. We have Iran, who still desires to be a nuclear power, and we have our treaty that we entered into with Iran. How should Biden handle the Middle East? What should he do there?
It's one of the most interesting and most important questions for the Biden administration. The attitude of some in the Biden administration is that American foreign policy has been too absorbed with the Middle East for too long. It's cost us too much in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and now China, we're getting virtually no energy, oil from the Middle East. China's getting a lot. It's time for others to take over the problems of that area. There are others who feel that as much as there are dangers in the area, there are also some opportunities. And so let's not turn to the military tools, because those haven't worked for us so well. But let's turn to tools we've had before and used before as the United States, which is diplomatic tools, working together with partners in the region. And so I think you're going to see some really difficult conversations within the Biden administration to see what priority they're going to give what. So I wrote a column myself on this about a month ago, suggesting that President Biden was standing in front of two doors. And one of the doors was rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal of President Obama, which you as Vice President Biden had something to do with. The second is walk through the Abraham Accords door, which was perhaps the most significant foreign policy accomplishment of the Trump administration, where Bahrain and the UAE reached a peace agreement with Israel. And since they reached it, Morocco and Sudan have joined, and others may join as well. So I actually argued in that piece, and the good thing is that when this happened, there's a temptation when you come in as a new president to condemn everything your predecessor has done and move on. And I think that might be even more the case in this really difficult transition. In the case of the Abraham Accords, however, President Biden praised this agreement, and his people want to build on it. The reason I think he should walk through that door first is by strengthening allies and the cooperation of allies in the Middle East, you start being able to create the sort of thing that we saw in Europe after World War II, which is collaborative arrangements, whether on the economy, whether on security, where the region becomes more capable of taking on its own issues collaboratively. We have a recent reduction of stress tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, between UAE and Qatar, and I think that will help in this direction. So the reason I'm saying door 2, the Trump-Abraham Accords door, and not door 1, is door 2 will help you get to door 1 more effectively. If you're actually showing progress in the rest of the Middle East, if you're showing that you spoke about Yemen, you spoke about Syria, but 18 of the 22 countries in the Middle East are not at war. And so if you can start building these economies, if you can start creating more human potential, the Atlantic Council, we have a program called Empower Middle East, which works on unlocking the human potential of women, entrepreneurs, and youth. So focus on that. And then with Iran, Biden wants to come up with an even better deal than the Obama administration had, so that you can address as well the Iranian, not only the Iranian nuclear weapons proliferation danger, but also the ballistic missile development that they're undergoing, and their malign regional behavior backing disruptive groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen. So I think that's going to be hard. I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's worth doing, because I think it's worth engaging diplomatically with Iran, but with a very sober recognition that they have elections in their country in June or July. The hardliners of Iran are not going to want to empower their more moderate opponents at this point. And I think the mood at Iran needs to take pressure off economically. It needs to reach a deal with the United States. But I don't think we want to go back to a deal that doesn't address what the regional neighbors of Iran worry most about, which is their ballistic missiles and their regional misbehavior, which on top of the nuclear weapons makes them such a disruptive force. So build on door 2 to get to door 1, be patient on door 1, and realize that it's going to be harder to solve that problem than to build on a real success story.
We are close to the time that we need to transition to audience questions, but I did want to ask one question that was triggered by something that Brian Lamb asked you a few years ago when you were a much younger man and had finished up a lengthy assignment, and we're wondering what to do next. And he asked you, what were you thinking about doing next? And would you go to Beijing for 2 years? I think you responded to him that you would really consider that. That would be a good sort of thing. But anyway, you have had a wondrous career in the Wall Street Journal. We haven't touched on that, and you led the Wall Street Journal, were in charge of the whole operations there longer than any other living person in the history of the Wall Street Journal. you segregated from there to lead the Atlantic Council. You've been at the Atlantic Council for 15 years. I think you started on December the 1st, 2007. You have had a miraculous run there. You've taken and the revenues that you've increased from about $4 million in the year you first were there in 2007 to I think the latest published 990 has them at 68 million, and correspondingly all the other figures that have been entered in the 990s show remarkable increases from when you came in 2007 to this year. So I know from with that kind of a record, probably every last member of the Atlantic Council and including the entire board would love to have you there until you step into your coffin. But that doesn't prevent me from asking the question, well, what are your thoughts about what's next after the Atlantic Council? What do you want to do? Have you given it any thought? How do you want to keep contributing?
It's such an interesting question, Bob. And so at the Atlantic Council, I never wake up in the morning saying, how am I going to compete with another think tank? In fact, I don't even like the term think tank, because thinking is a nice first step, but it's insufficient to getting anything done in the world. And so what I do is wake up in the morning and ask myself, how can we at the Atlantic Council, how can I, leading the Atlantic Council, be relevant? And our mission is shaping the global future together with partners and allies. And that's three really strong elements to that shaping the global future together motto. It's shaping, meaning it's activist. We don't just observe, we don't write papers that gather dust on shelves, we're shaping. The global future, that means we're looking forward. We're not just solving today's problems, we're trying to think about how we can shape the future. And then together, that's a description of, in our view, the United States has to act collaboratively. We at the Atlantic Council have to act collaboratively. Alone, you can't take on any of the major problems of the world, whether it's climate change, nuclear proliferation, human rights, et cetera. It has to be a collaborative sport. So I would be perfectly happy continuing to do this with the Atlantic Council and for the Atlantic Council, because the challenges keep changing. It's, I think, a historic inflection point where we can do a lot of good. So the Atlantic Council can't solve all the problems of the world, but we'd be selling ourselves short if we didn't want to contribute to their solution. And Margaret Mead wrote famously that one should never underestimate that a small group of dedicated individuals can improve the state of the world. She said it better than I just said it. And she said, indeed, that's the only thing that ever has changed the world, is committed individuals working together to do it. So I believe in that. There's another part of me that loves book writing. There's a part of me that loves to be alone in my research, looking into issues. I see over the top of your head my book, Berlin 1961, Bob, which I'm really pleased to see. And at the same time, I wouldn't mind writing another book or two. And if I can combine both of them, that would be a real gift. But I'm particularly taken with going back to history and understanding its lessons, because we just, if we understood history's lessons, we would avoid most of our problems, but we don't. And so I think I'd like to write a couple more books. There's a part of me, for me, my oxygen is learning, and my oxygen is new information, new understanding, talking to people who are smarter than I am to get the ideas that I need to enrich my own thinking. And so it's a great question. I could go on for a couple hours. I won't, but I think the outcome would be continuing to do the kind of valuable things I can do as a team at the Atlantic Council, but perhaps engage a little bit in the individual sport of book writing as well.
Well, I know the Berlin 1961 is an exciting book, and part of what it does is explain why the Cuban Missile Crisis really didn't need to happen, and what some of the fundamental mistakes were in assumptions about the Soviets that were made by Kennedy. Had he made what in retrospect were really the obvious right assumptions, that never would have happened. It's a fascinating story, and I recommend it to everyone to read. But I just wanted to note that the crisis, as you said before, crises provide opportunities, and you've taken that opportunity with the Atlantic Council to take an organization that was great at convening, but convening people in meetings, thinking about issues in dozens and in the low hundreds. And now what you've done is gone to the internet, to Zoom meetings, and the reach of the Atlantic Council has quintupled. And now the meetings that you're holding have doubled in number. And instead of being attended by 10 to 20 to 30 people, they're being attended by thousands of people, and several of them even in the tens of thousands of people around the world. So it's been a very major contribution, and we all thank you for the leadership that you've displayed, which has enabled the organization to take that big leap forward. I'd like to thank Jessica for all her good work that she continues to do with the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and turn the program back over to her to go to the audience for further questions for you, Fred.
But before you do that, Jessica, can I make one comment on what Bob just said?
Of course.
So Bob plays an instrumental leading role on the board, and it's such an impressive group of people, and it's a privilege to work for this organization. We saw March last year, we saw COVID-19 as a danger, but we saw in that danger an opportunity. And the opportunity, first of all, we had to take care of our people. We had to keep them healthy and our community healthy. But then we saw, it is a bit of a danger that we can't convene people physically, but let's use these new digital tools. Let's reach even more people. And so thank you for noticing what we did, because we really exponentially grew our audience, and our readership doubled, but our audience grew massively. We reached 1.8 million individuals over the course of the year through more than 600 events. And what you do is you can reach bigger audiences, but you can also reach smaller, better audiences. So if you're trying to bring together 5 people around the future of energy, and the best 5 people are in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and the US, and you've got 5 or 10 people, they'll come together and you'd never be able to get together before. So we've added employees. We added 2 centers last year, and I think what a lot of people saw is, if you look at an obstacle as an opportunity, even if it doesn't turn out as well as it did for us last year, it's still the right way to go about thinking about obstacles. So anyway, thank you for noticing that, Bob.
If we had more time, we would ask you what was in your conversation last week with Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, on energy, but we got to save that.
But it's so funny. I'm going to do 20 seconds on that, because that underscores the issue. So we had an Abu Dhabi Global Energy Forum that we do every year, and we had to do it virtually this year. And so we did have Prince Charles on talking about climate, because he's a real important climate player. But we also had on with him the CEOs of Bank of America and British Petroleum BP. Tried to put them all together in a room in Abu Dhabi. Never happened. But we were able to put them together with a global audience there. So it's really a good example. And Prince Charles was endearing and wonderful.
We could go on for 4 hours, but it's just no doubt.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt. But the first question, Fred, how do you see us addressing the Chinese use of military force in the Spratlys and Paracels, as well as the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, without using our military strength?
Yeah, there's a wonderful German phrase. I speak German, and it's "Ich bin überfragt," which means I am over questioned, which means I may not be the expert you want the answer from on this one. And so first of all, I'll just tell you I'm not an expert on military engagement in that part of the world. I will tell you what I know from the experts that I engage with, and that is that they fear that China will become so confident. This is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, July. Some have said that Taiwan should be brought back into China, lose its independence, be brought back into China by July. Others think it's the next 3 or 4 years. The Chinese could well calculate that the U.S. really isn't going to do anything militarily to stop us, and it would be just too dangerous for us to do so. So they could miscalculate and then do something with Taiwan. And I think Taiwan's the most dangerous piece of that. But part of what makes the rest of what you're talking about dangerous is because China has expanded in the South China Sea, has moved forward militarily without anybody doing anything against it. I think the best deterrent to that is for Taiwan to be well enough armed itself so that the Chinese themselves see it just too costly. The other thing is for we and our allies to send a very clear message that this will be costly to them economically, this will be costly to them in their prestige in the world. If they want to be a global leader, who's going to follow them if they do this? And so what we can do militarily against it is the area where, you know, it's tricky, and there are well elaborated plans as there are for anything that has this kind of likelihood, not likelihood, but possibility. But I think the best way to stop them from doing that is for them to understand that the costs for them, both in defense, but also in prestige and economy, would be too great.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, do you think it is feasible for the US and Germany to get on the same page regarding strategy towards China?
We could get on a similar page, but I doubt we're going to get on the same page. Germany is a large manufacturing power. A lot of its employment comes out of that manufacturing, and a lot of those export products go to China. China is Germany's largest trading partner, not the United States. They're very interesting poll that came out from the European Council on Foreign Relations. You can search it, came out last week, polling Europeans in general. And it shows that most Europeans believe that in 10 years, China will be a more dominant power than the United States. So that's just an interesting fact, along with the fact that China has now become the leading partner. So if we want Germany to decouple, it's not going to happen. If we want Germany to go down the road with us in lockstep, sanctioning, it may not happen either. If we go to Germany and Europe and say, look, China is an unfair trader, you can't negotiate with them on your own because you don't have enough leverage. Let's all go together to them and say you have to change this. There, I think we can get on the same page with Germany. And I think it would be really smart for us to do so. So China accelerated an investment agreement with the European Union at the end of last year. And it did so seeing Joe Biden's coming in and wants to grow closer to Europe and to our allies. And they preempted that by getting this investment agreement in. Instead of seeing that as the EU having acted against our interests, we ought to take a look at this agreement, see if there's part of it that we think is right, and then get together with Europe and say, well, now the way forward, let's not do things alone. Let's not compete with each other on China, although there's going to be some of that. Let's figure out what we together want to get from China. So I don't think we'll ever be on the same page just because of the reliance on the economy and manufacturing in Germany, but I think we can negotiate together on issues of common concern better than we have.
Thank you. What makes you think Russia will really be different after Putin leaves, whenever that is? We let down our guard after the wall came down, and for the last 20 years, the oligarch kleptocracy has supported the government invading Georgia, Ukraine, etc. Corruption's worse than ever. Why should we expect them to change long term?
there are different schools of thought about that, and these are questions from our viewers, right? They're great questions. So there are some who think if Putin goes, it could be someone even worse. That, you know, at least Putin's calculable. He doesn't step over certain lines. Someone could come in who's even more nationalistic, who's even takes bigger risks and takes. That's possible. That's why I say we have to start planning. We have to start thinking about this, because there's a really remarkably rich, and I don't mean financially, I mean rich, intellectually rich in terms of capability, Russian diaspora. You know, they would like to see their country develop in a way that goes beyond its energy resources, its nuclear weapons, and kind of a disruptor. So it won't be easy, and there have to be some good thinking and some incentives that one has to give in Russia. But I agree with the question that there's just as much likelihood that you either continue with Putinism or it gets worse, as there is to replace it with something better and more democratic and more Western. That won't happen unless we're all focused on it. And that's why I'm arguing to focus on it, because I think when somebody like that leaves, things are going to change. They're going to be changed for the better or for the worse, but that's a moment in time one can actually begin to shape things, and we ought to start thinking about that now.
This next questioner says, I am a Lebanese American with deep concerns as to where Lebanon and surrounding Arab countries are being left to die a slow death, while we worry about all of our relationships and economic growth partnerships at the expense of people's civilizations and complete countries. I would like to hear your thoughts as to how we can move the dial of the American leadership east.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. You know, we have a center focusing on unlocking the human potential of the Middle East and other sort of social and economic issues, which is the Rafi Hariri Center for the Middle East. And it's named for the great prime minister of your country, Rafi Hariri, who was assassinated in 2005. So in our bloodstream at the Atlantic Council, we have a great respect for him. We have great respect for his vision of a secular, modern, forward-leaning country. The country, it'd be too long, I'm not expert enough to discuss where things have gone wrong, but there's a lot of corruption. We've talked about corruption eroding democracies. There's a lot of corruption in Lebanon. And there's a chance right now with the problems in Lebanon for Lebanon to turn a corner into a better future. One can only hope that will be the case. I do think that it is worthwhile for Europe and the United States together to remain engaged in Europe, in the Middle East, to help institutions develop themselves, perhaps a Middle East equivalent to NATO, not necessarily with the US as in the same role as in Europe, but a security organization, potentially an economic organization. There are these sorts of organizations in Middle East, but they're not very well developed. I don't think the Middle East is going to get there on its own, but it doesn't need that much help from us. But if we go in together with Europe, we could nudge things in the right direction. If you're nudging things in the right direction, it makes it easier to take on a situation like Lebanon and say, look, you know, we've now got the UAE, Saudi Arabia, hopefully over time, you know, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, Israel in this community. We'd like to reach out to you in Lebanon because you do have such a rich history. Let's work together on this. So I think that would be, if I've understood the question right, I think that would be the best thing long term for Lebanon, because Lebanon left to its own devices is going to be ripped apart by this competition between Iran and others. So Iran backing Hezbollah and others backing others, and the Lebanese people just deserve a lot better.
What would be the Biden administration's North Korea policy, and how would you compare it with its Iran approach?
These are really great questions. I think the Iran approach is, we did have a deal. let's try to find our way back to the deal. But to do that, Iran is going to have to reverse some of the things it's done in nuclear enrichment. We're going to have to reverse some of the sanctions, but we're also going to want to have some commitments that Iran's going to go further forward on these other issues, ballistic missiles and regional misbehavior. I think that's a tough road to hoe. With North Korea, I think there'll be more. President Trump, former President Trump, was very confident in his own negotiation capabilities. And so he really thought meeting one-on-one with Kim Jong-un could move things along and could get North Korea to be a more cooperative player. One shouldn't dismiss entirely that effort, because you did have a period of time where it does seem as though there was a little bit of a slowdown in the development of nuclear capabilities and disruptive activities. I think the Biden administration will take a more conventional approach to this through negotiations, I think also involving our partners and allies, and also involving China. And because it's not in anyone's interest that you have this failed nuclear state in this really sensitive geographic area. And North Korea's got such desperate economic needs that it could be that a more conventional approach now could have dividends, but who knows? It may just take a more rational actor running North Korea. There's always these rumors that the leader is ill or the leader is not running things any longer and his sister is running things, but so far those just seem to be rumors. But change could come rapidly. And what I'd be watching for is, does change at some point come so rapidly in North Korea that you actually have a unification scenario? And so I always am a person who likes to think in the future and how would you actually leverage change for good. And so I actually think we should play out some of those scenarios.
Well, thank you so much. We have so many other questions, and I know we'd love to get to them. So hopefully when things open up, you can come out and see us in Los Angeles. Bob, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. We appreciate all yours and Kim's wonderful work and contributions you've made to all of us this year and years in the past. Fred, it's okay. You came, you were heard. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. Appreciate everything that you've done for all those who benefit from your ideas, your hard work, and your success.
Well, thank you so much for I'm sorry. Excuse me. I was just going to thank you both. This is such an informative discussion, but please continue, Fred.
No, Kim, thank you so much. I've got a huge respect for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I actually launched one of my books there when I was in California, but it was so many years ago that probably you don't even have archives to record that. But what you're doing to bring people together around these sorts of conversations, whenever we can work together with you at the Atlantic Council, it would be our honor. And thanks to Bob again for everything you do for so many causes in the world. And it's always an honor to be on a single stage with you as well, Bob. So it was a great pleasure. I'd love to take up the offer to, when the pathogen passes, to get out to the West Coast.
We'll take you up on that, Fred. We'd love to partner with you on more programs. This is so fascinating. So thank you so much for your time and expertise. For our audiences, we are going to be continuing these live streams throughout 2021. We also hope to bring back our in-person events as soon as it's safe. We'll continue to provide these live streams for free as a public service. So please consider making a contribution to cover our production costs. You can text the word GIVE to a number that will be on the screen in just a moment. If you're not a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall, please consider joining. There's lots of benefits that you can find out about on our website, lawacth.org. Just a quick update on some of our programs this week and next. Tomorrow, we have a program on Is India the Next Global Superpower? Also, tomorrow afternoon, our young professionals are producing a program, Globalization After 2020, Reset or Retrench. Next week, Building National Security in an Unstable World with the former FBI Assistant Director. We also have Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnurr. Also, a high school program, How Gen Z Can Shape the Future of Technology. And of course, February 19th, Bill Gates and his new book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster. So please go to our website and register today. Bob, thank you again for moderating. You're such an asset to the council town hall. We appreciate you so much. And Fred, let's say this is a beginning for more terrific partnerships together. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.